Well, Global Chamber members, I'm honored this day to be able to share with you an event on the laws of conflict, commerce risk, and the rules that govern both with two noted subject matter experts with a mission to provide a balanced perspective, but also to give these experts an opportunity to share their unique views that form that baseline viewpoint. As you might recollect from this event, this is Globinar for What's Up in Global Law. And I'm Chris Bennett, founder of TIL and also a member of the Global Chamber's Baltimore-Washington International Advisory Committee. I'm going to do a brief introduction for our speakers, provide the standard housekeeping items that we're not giving legal advice, and then jump right into it. We are privileged today to have Professor Jeffrey Korn joining us, someone who has both military experience as well as academic experience and brings to the table a view of how a large organization that's responsible for leading conflicts for our country helps to manage itself. We also, to complement that, we have noted Professor Gabor Rona, who has worked with United Nations and other organizations looking at conflict from the perspective of those who are involved in it at a state actor level, but also experiencing it at an organizational and individual level. And those two balancing perspectives will be of interest to you as you do business and as you move forward. Respect to the Global Chamber and quick housekeeping items. Even though each person that's speaking today is a lawyer, we're not giving legal advice. We're sharing experiences, observations, and insights, and viewpoints where it is of value to the speakers. Also, since this is a Memorial Day weekend, I would be remiss in not wishing best Memorial Day to service members. 6 of my uncles were service members, and I didn't know my birth father, so they were surrogate fathers for me. And I have tremendous respect for what they've done and what the families contribute. In concert, I also have a lot of respect for the folks who try to avoid conflict, which is our focus for today. I'm a member of a fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, in which members like Martin Luther King, who sought peace, were members. So with that jumping off point, let's get started. As you know, our approach is we will initially consult with large language models to get their viewpoint on what's the most important thing in the world today. And on the screen, you see feedback from ChatGPT, Claude or Anthropic, Gemini, Perplexity, and Llama. They each had a unique view. And so at this stage of the show, I will offer my view on whether I agree with them or not, and if so, briefly why, and ask the same of our subject matter experts. So based on the comments that I saw, I actually don't agree with any of them. There's quite a bit of viewpoint of artificial intelligence. I'm aware, and I know it could have a transformative impact, but also a lot of that is influenced by the hype cycle of a technology in which people have invested billions of capital and they want to see billions of return on investment. It is important, it is essential to advancing in that area, but I don't agree with that level of hype. There is some information on conflict. I agree that it has an equal perspective. So I would say it's more of a balanced viewpoint, that I have a different view that of what's most important today. I think it's the totality of the circumstances, to borrow a phrase from my academic background. Let's pitch this over and ask the same of our subject matter experts. So Professor Korn, do you agree with what the LLM said is the most important thing today?
I mean, first off, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with my friend Gabor. When I think of the most important issue in the world, my mind doesn't go to the domain of law that I study and practiced in. I think that's an important aspect of national security and an important aspect of the protection of fundamental human rights around the world in situations of conflict. but I think political scientists would tell you that if your goal is to prevent ever having to worry about applying the laws of war or humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, then you should seek to prevent conflict. And the single most significant factor in preventing conflict is democratization and the development of genuine liberal democracies, because historically they, number one, don't fight each other. And number two, they are restrained and abusing their own populations. So for me, the most significant or important issue in the world today is um, the kind of slide towards less legitimate democracy, more um, division in populations, more isolationism, more of a sense that the ends always justify the means politically, and the direction that's taking the world, because we know historically that this ultimately leads to conflict, which is what we ought to be seeking to avoid. Um, so I think the political trends, the demographic trends in the world, and what I think most of us see as a genuine challenge to the kind of what we might call liberal or democratic world order that has been the central feature of U.S. vitality and national security since the end of World War II being challenged, and this kind of regional America first philosophy gaining such traction is one of the most important issues for our country and by definition for the world in the era that we're living in.
Thank you for that, Professor Cohen. Professor Gabor, Professor Rona, what's your perspective on the LLM's response?
Um, well, again, thanks for having me as well on this program. Jeff and I have known each other for a long time. There's a lot that we agree on, a little bit that we disagree on from time to time. So it's always good to be together. As to this question, Chris, I don't have much to add to what Jeff said. I agree, and I mean, looking at these responses, what I'm seeing are kind of specific observations in the realm of discrete areas of either international law or foreign affairs, international governance. And I tend to agree with Jeff that you can put all of these observations into one basket, take a step back, and come to the conclusion that none of these things get solved unless we have an international legal order. And I never thought in my professional lifetime that I would have to come to the defense of the concept of an international legal order until the last decade or so. But what we have been witnessing in connection with the laws of armed conflict, in connection with aspects of foreign relations in general, in other aspects of international law, is a real dangerous shift. Now, there have always been violations of international law. There have always been violations of the laws of armed conflict. There have always been war crimes. But traditionally, at least states, when they talk about international legal obligations, they don't dismiss the entire project of international law. What they tend to do is deny the factual allegations or deny that the facts that they're charged with constitute war crimes, for example. They don't dismiss the entire project, as I said, of international law. And that is a new and dangerous development that we're seeing. And not even so much with, let's take, for example, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia attempted to justify it falsely on the basis that there were atrocities being committed against Russian speakers in Ukraine, that Russia was doing this in self-defense. These are the typical kind of responses that are well within the international legal framework, even though they are false and disingenuous. Compare that with recent pronouncements in the Trump administration. When asked recently about, well, what about international law, President Trump? He famously said, I don't need international law, as if it was some, option on a new car purchase, like heated seats. And then the Secretary of Defense says also famously that, well, we now want to emphasize lethality over legality. In other words, what we're seeing now is very different than mere violations or justification of violations. What we're seeing is a dismissal of the international legal order. And I have to say that scares the hell out of me.
Professor Rona, thank you for that. And that sets a great stage, both your and Professor Korn's share into, by the way, for the audience, in the record, we're including the more detailed versions of each of the LLM's responses. And we'll share that for transparency, we actually ran the prompt for each of them through one LLM, through Anthropic. So bear in mind, there may be a little bit of bias built into that. But what each of our speakers just shared gets us into the next step. So we asked specifically for each LLM, what was its viewpoint on the top development in conflict? And they covered a number of different areas. I'm going to show my bias here because I delve into both technology, innovation, and law, and say that I have significant concerns about autonomous weapons for a number of reasons. So I would tend to lean toward Perplexity's viewpoint on that particular area. And I'll now defer to our panelists, and I'll go in the reverse order this time. Professor Rona, do you agree with the LLMs on the top development in conflict for today?
So what I see here is reference to the International Criminal Court, reference to autonomous weapons systems, cyber operations in armed conflict, again, autonomous weapons, and then a much kind of a broader reference to compliance issues. So this is kind of a mixed bag. I think if we move on from your initial question, where Jeff and I think both have similar concerns about the entire package of rule of law and democracy, and we get more specific into conflict related and law of armed conflict related issues. I do think that the last observation, which is somewhat different than the others. So the first four talk about specific aspects of how war is conducted and the regulation of new technologies, for example. The Excuse me a second, my power apparently is going off.
Okay.
Let me just make sure that I'll be okay. Hold on a second.
Okay. Would you like us to pivot to Professor Korn?
No, wait, I'm back. I'm good. I
Okay.
had to plug it back in. I'm so sorry about that.
No worries.
So, where the first four observations are about specific aspects of the conduct of hostilities, the last one, which is the question of actual compliance, I think is probably the most important of these. We have a lot of law. There is no lack of international legal regulation of armed conflict, but we do have a yawning gap between what the law requires and what parties to armed conflict actually do. And one of the reasons for that is, well, states make this law. And if states want to have effective compliance mechanisms, they create them. And if they don't want them, they don't create them. So I think part of the problem here is that we have lip service to these regulations in the law of armed conflict from states, but we don't have a full-throated commitment to enforce those regulations. So this gap between what the law is and what mechanisms are available and what mechanisms are respected to actually honor these obligations, by which I mean holding violators accountable. I do think that is probably the most significant challenge to the law of armed conflict. In addition, there are, of course, challenges that arise from newly emerging technologies. But even if we solve all those, we're not going to really solve anything if we don't have compliance, if we don't have accountability, and if we don't have states buy-in into enforcement and remedies for victims.
Thank you for that, Professor Rona. Professor Korn, do you agree with our LLM sources, or do you have a different view?
Well, I tend to agree that the first four are kind of subcomponents of the last one. I mean, they're all related to a potential erosion in compliance with the law. But I think that, so I think that in terms of conflict regulation, we'll call it, the erosion of respect for the law is historically and remains today a critical issue. And to me, it comes down to one word, and that's leadership, right? Leadership at all levels of national power that employ military force, whether you're talking about the political leaders that make the decision to use force or individual battlefield leaders who are responsible for the execution of those operations. But I think there are subcomponents to that that are very complicated. I agree with Gabor. There's a lot of law. And Gabor says the problem is that it's not, there are times when it's not respected and enforced the way it's supposed to be. One of the questions is who decides the way it's supposed to be interpreted? I mean, many of these rules are the result of consensus among states in the form of treaties or consistent practice among states, but there's always an element of ambiguity there because in order to get widespread consensus, oftentimes you have to build in ambiguity to the meaning of terms. So who decides what the law actually requires? What is the role of the state versus non-state organizations versus international judicial tribunals versus domestic tribunals versus the academic community? One of the most significant, in my experience, one of the most significant aspects of the evolution, understanding, and some would say maybe erosion of respect for the law has been the exponential increase in commentators on what the law requires, whether it's being complied with. I started studying this when I became very basically when I became an intelligence officer in 1984, and then when I became a JAG officer in 1989, and then I taught at the JAG school from 96 to 2000. And I can tell you this idea that every time there's an incident that occurs in a conflict, you'll have Insta symposiums and scholars all over the world weighing in on what they think is right and wrong and how the law should be interpreted. I don't think the people who created the law ever contemplated that level of the voluminous amount of information involved. And you can just watch the news and see this. Whenever there's an incident in a war, there'll be pundits coming on the news commentating constantly about what the law requires. How do we manage all that? How does that influence the development of the law? So even figuring out what the law means, who gets to say what the law means, is a challenge in and of itself. But I think more fundamentally, part of that is why the law matters. Okay. I think for me today, where we are right now, and some of the comments Gabor made about what I think are the foolish comments by national leaders of our own government, not to mention other governments, that posture themselves as icons of respect for the law, and then you have commentary that is fundamentally inconsistent with that. I think one of the real challenges that we confront as an international community is why the law matters.
Mm-hmm.
And it matters for a lot of reasons. And I think Gabor and I would come at it from different directions, but reach the same conclusion that it matters immensely, right? Yes, we instinctively think it matters because it mitigates the human suffering of war. It protects civilians who are victims of war. It facilitates restoration of peace. But I think what I find most disturbing about the commentary of our senior political leaders is what appears to be a lack of appreciation that it matters for the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who have to engage in the brutal business of waging war on behalf of their nation, right? And people forget that this law, this code, when there's some clarity in right and wrong on the battlefield, it serves a moral purpose. It protects warriors from moral hazard. It's because ultimately the law does not exist to protect civilians. That's a function of the law. The law exists to balance the violence of war against humanitarian interest of mitigating the risk to innocent people, innocent property, and reducing the harmful consequences of war. So that balance necessarily acknowledges that men and women are going to engage in mortal combat.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an easy thing to think about. And most people who are commenting on the law, in my opinion, have never had even the moment where they had to contemplate having to do that business, having to engage in that conduct. When we start dismissing the relevance of the law, that we're going to prioritize lethality over legality, as if those are incompatible. And Gabor and I would recognize they are not incompatible. You can be lethal and decisive and legal at the same time. That's what the law is designed to do. But we send a corrosive message that respect for limits of brutality in war is somehow counterproductive to your ultimate operational, tactical, or strategic objective. And that is a existential danger, because what it does, it takes you down a slippery slope of brutality, unrestrained brutality, that has not only adverse consequences of the victims of war, but also adverse consequences on the men and women who engage in that conduct.
Wow. Professor Korn and Professor Rona, those are powerful shares. Um, and now here's the tough part, to pivot and get your individual perspective on building a bridge between the seriousness of the nature of what each of you just described and your typical business person or not-for-profit or creative who's trying to operate in that environment from a commercial perspective, which is representative of the Global Chamber's audience. So let's build on that. And again, we've maintained the entire detailed record for folks who want to receive this and look at it later. But let's build on that by asking each of you individually to tell us a little bit about what kind of bridge should each of our members be thinking about as they try to do business in the current global environment from a conflict perspective. And let's start with Professor Korn, if you would.
Well, I could start by echoing what Gabor said, that we have to recognize that when you dismiss the relevance of international law, you are going down a dangerous path. Because then what you're doing is, at the national level, you are endorsing a notion of the ends always justifies the means, that the strong and the powerful dominate the weak and the less powerful. And you incentivize the weak and the less powerful to try and figure out ways to offset that. You know, one of the interesting aspects of the conflict in Iran, which Gabor and I might disagree as a matter of law, was legally justified in terms of the policy consequences of it. If you are a weaker state, then it seems to appear that the safest bet you have is to arm yourself to the teeth, particularly with nuclear weapons, because we're not going after North Korea's nuclear stockpile, right? But we did go after Libya. We were going after Iran before they developed the weapon. There's an instability that comes with rejecting the relevance of international law. And at the military operational level, again, I think it's very dangerous to assume that the ends should always justify the means. You know, one of the rules of law of war that is most commonly debated among international lawyers and scholars is the proportionality rule. Now, I have my view on that because I think lawyers love balancing tests. They love to debate. They love to argue one side or the other, and that's what proportionality is. And I've written on this, in my view, as an operational tool. If I'm advising a commander, it has limited utility because there's so much uncertainty in what qualifies as excessive civilian harm in any given attack. Having said that, I think it is reflective of one of the most important principles of the law that regulates war, and that is it is a clear statement that the ends may not always justify the means. No matter whether, if you identify a military target, there are times when attacking it is simply not justified because of the human consequence of doing it. And that is a bedrock principle of the law. And when we dismiss the relevance of the law, we start to suggest that the ends should justify the means. So when you're in civil society, when you're in the community that you're talking about, and you're trying to make sense of everything you're seeing, right? Reject the suggestion that the ends always justifies the means. That is a race to the bottom. And it is historically validated that we can live within this legal framework, we can live within these legal constraints and still achieve our ends and goals. I was reading a book by Rick Atkinson on the the Allied campaign in Italy during World War II, and I came across a passage that I'd never heard before, which really surprised me. They were stuck at the Kesselring line. Monte Cassino was the strong point on the Kesselring line, and the Allied commanders were frustrated that they couldn't penetrate because of Monte Cassino. And there was a long-term debate over whether to bomb it. Now, we know we ultimately decided to bomb it, and that actually proved to be counterproductive, the destruction of a very significant cultural object. But more fundamentally, it made it easier for the Germans to defend it. But in one of the meetings where they were debating whether or not to attack Monte Cassino, the abbey, General Eisenhower admonished his subordinate commanders, you will not allow military necessity to become a synonym for military convenience. In other words, there has to be genuine justification for every act of violence you engage in war. And that, I think, when you're observing what the United States is doing and other nations do, that's ultimately what you should be asking. Does it appear that this harm, this destruction was genuinely necessary to achieve a valid objective? So that would be one aspect of how do I manage dealing with all this. I think the other is we have to be very, very careful of falling into the trap of what I've called effects-based condemnations, right? The law that regulates a commander's decision to use force in battle is not result-oriented. It's decision-oriented. What the law demands is a reasonable judgment. Now, we can get into all the details of what makes something a target and whether you've done precautions and all of but fundamentally, as criminal lawyers would say, these are not result offenses, these are conduct offenses. So what we have to do when we see what appears to be an adverse result is recognize that unless you go back and recreate the decision-making situation and you understand why a commander made the decision to launch an attack, and then assess whether under the circumstances it was in a zone of reasonableness, then you're not properly applying the system the way it was designed. And instead, if all you do is look at the result and say that must have been illegal, that's like me saying 1 plus I don't know equals 10. Now, I'm not suggesting that results are irrelevant. They are highly relevant. because they are circumstantial evidence of whether the judgment was legitimate.
Okay.
But frequently, the results alone are not sufficient to make that judgment. So we have to be more, I think, willing to say, I'm skeptical of the legality of that attack. I want more information about it. I want a credible investigation. The hearings the other day in front of the Senate, where the CENTCOM commander was criticized because we still don't have the details of why that girls' school in Iran was struck. And the senators were saying, it's too long, it's taking too long. Can't you even acknowledge that it may have been a mistake, and why was it a mistake? We need to know that. Transparency in that realm is critical. And if the military is not transparent, you are encouraging this effects-based condemnation. But I think observers of war have to be very careful of judging the legality of attack decisions based only on what they're seeing, without understanding why those decisions were made.
Wow. And I have a couple more minutes for your sector, Professor Korn. So how did you, if you were empathizing as a business person, what would be the things you would want to consider in your day-to-day business pursuits?
I mean, the first thing I'd want to consider is I hope we're not fighting wars.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard for me to think of a war that has produced a positive impact on global stability, regional stability. I mean, they are incredibly disruptive. And I heard one general say once, starting a war is like walking into a pitch black room and hoping that when the lights come on, you know what's there. You don't control outcomes, you control decisions. So emphasizing the economic value of a predictable global order, the economic value of limiting resort to military force to situations where it is consistent with international legal principles. And yes, Gabor and I might disagree on certain decisions that the United States has made, but here's where we don't agree, right? I believe that there are times where the interpretations of international law can be pushed. We could say pushing the envelope. That's different than shredding the envelope. Simply tearing it up and saying it doesn't matter, that's counterproductive to the nation's long-term interest, to our long-term national security interest. And I think it's a false sense of achievement, right? I mean, you just have to consider these attacks on these boats in the Caribbean. It creates a sense of we're doing something. But there are human lives that are being taken in situations where you'd be hard pressed to find international law experts who would say it's consistent with even a stretched interpretation of international law, even a forward leaning interpretation. Now, in the short term, you might say, so what? They're just some guys in a boat running drugs. But the long term adverse consequences of that, we haven't even begun to feel yet. And it just keeps going. So I think it's engagement. The answer to your question is your audience are people who have influence politically, socially in their communities. They need to be engaged in this process. And when they see something that doesn't match General Eisenhower's admonition, where military necessity has become a synonym for military convenience, or as I like to say, when your favorite tool is a hammer, you start making every problem look like a nail. And my perception is for the current administration, they're enamored with the tool of military power. So they start to make every problem look like a nail. And that ultimately is counterproductive. So be engaged in a process where you question the legitimacy of these decisions and these actions. So it's not just chatter among lawyers like me and Gabor in some internet debate, and the policymakers just ignore that because they say that's just a bunch of ivory tower lawyers chit-chatting about it. This is more significant than that. This is human life that we're talking about. And it's the lives of the men and women who have to fight these wars that we're talking about.
Wow. Professor Korn, thank you so much for that share. And we'll have a couple of questions in the time remaining that are specific to business, but I want to build on that by asking Professor Rona, to share his perspective in about a 10-minute share on the topic and its implications on business and commerce.
Um, so I will do that, but again, I want to put it back into the perspective of some really um, gargantuan shifts that have
Mm,
taken place recently in the international state of affairs.
okay.
So, for example, and this is quite analogous to what business should be concerned with. The U.S. military, throughout its modern history, has always had judge advocates general, lawyers who advise commanders on compliance with the laws of armed conflict in connection with each and every prospective military attack.
Mhm.
They advise in connection with the principle that combatants may be targeted, but civilians may not. They advise in connection with the principle, as Jeffrey mentioned, of proportionality, that while it is conceivable and even acceptable that there is civilian harm, that an attack that results in civilian harm that is anticipated to be in excess of the military advantage gained is an attack that shouldn't happen.
Mm,
Another principle is that of precaution. Commanders are responsible to do whatever is reasonably within their power to avoid civilian harm, whether it's to people or objects. And the way in which these principles are implemented in armed conflict is through the experienced and kind of learned advice of lawyers who have this expertise. I think business needs to take on the same norms. A business that engages in armed conflict contexts, armed conflict situations, and that does not have the benefit of independent and expert legal advice as to compliance with these principles is asking for potential for criminal responsibility and potential for civil responsibility.
mhm,
And this is because the laws of armed conflict don't only apply to states. They don't only apply to non-state armed groups,
mm,
insurgencies, terrorist organizations. The concept of war crimes is one that applies to each and every individual caught up in armed conflict, whether they are a promulgator of the hostilities or a bystander of the hostilities. And so these rules of the laws of armed conflict apply just as much to private entities, private individuals, and to businesses as they do to militaries. And for that reason, I think it is essential for private businesses that find themselves engaged in conflict have the same kind of expert and independent legal advice as to their exposure, whether it's
mhm,
criminal exposure or civil exposure, that the military has for its own forces. And,
mm,
and as Jeff said, primarily for the protection of the military mission, for the protection of those in uniform who were sent out to do the fighting, but
mhm,
also for the purpose of protecting innocent civilians that are caught up in conflict. So my bottom line advice and my just very broad advice to business
mhm,
would be you need expert and independent, and independent is important here. Do not take your legal advice from political leaders or for military leaders or for the people
mhm,
that or from the people who you're negotiating these military contracts with. You need your
mhm,
own independent legal advice on how what you are doing, whether it's preparing for conflict, for example, through the development of weapons and munitions, or involvement in conflict, such as is the case with private military and security contracting companies, or private prisons, for example.
Mhm.
You need
Mhm.
your own independent legal advice as to what it is that you are doing and how it relates to compliance with these all important IHL principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution.
Okay. Uh, Professor Rona, thank you so much for that share. And that collectively has set what I think is a fair and balanced baseline for global chamber members to consider. And that kind of moves us toward some specific questions that we gathered to research and through some of the members, and also to transitioning to closing out the program for today. On the screen now are some of the questions that were asked. And so if each of you could briefly consider a response, we'll go through those. And I think you just addressed some of it. How does it apply when a company is operating in or near a conflict zone? Are there any specific considerations they should take? And I'll defer to either of you if you want to jump in and respond.
I mean, generally, you have people working for you who are at risk of the consequences of the conflict. I mean, there's common sense things, I'm assuming, that governing authorities of those organizations will make sure their people know how to get help, how to get out, but understand also that they are, depending on how proximate they are to a conflict zone and the nature of the conflict, they're probably not going to be the priority interest of a military commander, even a friendly military commander. You have U.S. civilians in an area and there's a military operation going on. That's not going to be the priority of effort. They need to understand that. I mean, it would seem to me, if you know that there's a conflict breaking out, you want to get away from it.
Okay.
Gabor talked about the potential liability of complicity with certain activities, and that's a real concern both internationally and domestically, but it doesn't seem to be, what legal exposure do they face when
Mhm.
they're dealing with a state actor? And that's going to get more complicated in relation to some of the things you raised earlier, cyber, artificial intelligence. You didn't have space up there. Space is another interesting aspect of that. But you're not necessarily immune from international criminal liability simply because you're not in the military per se, depending on whether you could be proved to be complicit with certain violations of the law. And I'll answer question 3. Are private security contractors subject to the laws, and what are the liability implications? Well, again, yes, they're subject to law, mainly the domestic law of the state that's using them or the state where they're operating, which will often be an aspect of some type of agreement if you're there with the consent of the state. For example, we were in Iraq or Afghanistan and you had private military contractors, there were agreements that provided them certain immunities from the host state, but they're subject to domestic law. And all of anybody involved in those activities ought to understand that there's federal criminal law
Mhm.
that applies to civilians who are accompanying the armed forces uh, in military operations, and in fact, they're subject to military criminal law. The Uniform Code of Military Justice was amended to subject civilians who accompany the forces during contingency operations to military criminal jurisdiction. They're also subject to the War Crimes Act, which is a federal criminal law, and the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which makes it a federal criminal offense to do anything during one of those operations that would have been a crime if it was committed in federal jurisdiction. So there's a
Wow.
lot of potential criminal liability that applies to contractors. And much of this was the result of changes to the law that were adopted after the Blackwater incident in Iraq, when there was a congressional sense there was too much impunity for
Mhm.
security contractors.
Thank you for that. And just as we move forward the questions, I want to ping Mijong Hibbets, who's the director of the Baltimore Washington International chapter for the Global Chamber, because we have a number of defense contractors and others in the community. So, Mijong, if you can channel any things that you're hearing from members, please do come off mute and offer your perspective. And I also want to energize, I think I see Antoinette Chapel in as well. Antoinette, if you have any things that you'd like to share with the panel, again, please come off mute or put something in the chat. And while that settles a bit, I want to,
Christopher,
yes.
hi.
Hi,
This is Doug Brunke. I'm the CEO of Global Chamber.
Hi, Doug.
Can I have a moment?
Oh, please do.
I've just been really impressed by this conversation, the high quality intellectual approach based on real experience, and recommendations and the ideas that you've laid out here is critically important for us to understand. I wonder, from a question standpoint, those of us in business, it can be great for you to be aligned politically with whatever administration is in power. Whenever any administration does things that appear to be beyond the line, from a perspective of whatever. It's happened throughout history, and the entire history of the 250 years of the United States, where the government did some great things and the government did some things that weren't always appreciated at the time. Sometimes in error, it was like, boy, that's not very good, but in the long run, it was a good thing. So we don't always know. And at Global Chamber, we're not judgmental. We don't do that. We're just, how do we grow business? And so I'm wondering, if you could, from a business perspective, how should business people react to what's happening and some of the issues that you've raised today? How should, I mean, that's a complicated question, and it may be case by case, but we want to do the right thing, but we also want to grow our business, and we don't want to be penalized for being a naysayer. Certainly not that. Any advice there?
Wow, these are interesting questions. I will tell you, I have not really thought about these issues through that lens that much. Here's my instinct. And as business leaders, I think this is probably instinctive to what you do. Be very careful about knee-jerk judgments, one way or the other, that something's legal or illegal. There's a lot of chatter about it. Oftentimes, when we're talking about wartime decisions, we have limited information at the inception, but a voracious appetite for judgment at the same time, like an inverse relationship. I want judgment very rapidly, but I have limited information. Having said that, as business leaders, you know that the more information you have, the better your decisions will be. So I don't think there's anything inconsistent with being agnostic politically to expect the systems to function effectively, that investigations are done credibly and transparently. And if your sense is they're not and they affect your business, then I think that it's legitimate to raise the question, why? Why don't we know more? What is holding up information in this regard? And I also think, and this goes to a point Gabor made, that there are genuine concerns about institutional mechanisms that are being tinkered with or eroded, like the whole issue of the role of military lawyers in the planning and execution and critique of military operations. Now, I would disagree with Gabor. I don't think, in my experience, military lawyers are not involved in every use of force decision. That's not realistic. And as a matter of fact, the main focus of the military today, and most of our allied militaries, is to shift their preparation from a counterinsurgency model to what they're calling LSCO, large-scale combat operations. If, let's hope it never happens, but if we have to engage in large-scale combat operations in Europe, in the Korean Peninsula, in the Far East, wherever it may be, the decisive element in ensuring respect for this law is no longer going to be the lawyer in the command center. They're going to play an important role. It's going to be junior combat leaders, lieutenants and captains and first sergeants and sergeants first class who are leading combat forces and have to make split-second decisions operating under a dispersed command and control environment. And if you don't prepare them for that, if training and developing a culture of respect for the law is not part of leader development, you are setting the conditions for failure, because our US especially, our military operations are going to be judged by the perception of legitimacy. And legitimacy is going to be judged by your perceived commitment to the rule of law. I mean, all you have to do is look at the degradation of the legitimacy of the Israeli Defense Forces to understand this. There's widespread condemnation of the IDF and Israel because of what happened in Gaza. And we could debate whether or not all of that is credible or not, but perception becomes reality. And the people that are going to define that perception are junior leaders. What that means is senior leaders have to emphasize respect for the law and have to emphasize the value of the law. So I think as business leaders engaged in this kind of peripherally, one of the things we should be looking at is whether the mechanisms for respect for the rule of law and compliance with the law and the preservation of legitimacy of military operations are being enhanced or degraded. And if they're being degraded, that raises a really important point of asking why. Why? Why are you cutting out the significance of this law, suggesting it doesn't matter? What do you think you're going to get out of it? Because I promise you in the long term, the consequence will be adverse.
Can I say something about that, Chris?
Please do. I think, and if we may, we'll give you the last word, Professor Rana, because I think we're about to hit our mark.
Okay. I have a very simple bit of advice that follows up from what I was saying earlier about the need for independent legal advice to business interests. And that simple piece of advice is don't trust the government. And I have to say, because I'm an academic, I'm free to say whatever the hell I want. Especially don't trust this government, this administration, for the reasons I said before, because they have simply said it's okay to not only to color outside the lines, but to throw away the book. Businesses that profit from conflict may be inclined to conclude that, well, if the gloves are off, then the sky's the limit. I can do whatever I want. But that would be a short-sighted conclusion. For one thing, as important a cog as the United States is in the wheel of the international legal order, we are retreating from that order. And in the preferred metaphor of President Trump, what that actually means is we have fewer cards to play than we used to in the past, because other states will fill that vacuum. And also, just as surely as the Trump administration attempts to undermine international law, hopefully the Trump administration is not going to be the last US administration. There's going to be a successor. And when there is a successor, or when there are other countries that pick up from where this administration left off, there might be very different perspectives about accountability than there are within this administration. So that is why I think it is so essential that businesses have independent and really expert legal advice. And by independent, I don't only mean don't take your advice from the government, but I also mean having legal advisors who aren't afraid to tell you as the CEO, no, you can't do that. And should be able to explain the reason you can't do that is because even though this administration may want you to do that, may have no problems with you doing that, you could be prosecuted and held responsible in other countries. You can find yourself vacationing in the south of France and be arrested and charged with war crimes for something that had nothing to do with France. And that's because countries that are party to the Geneva Conventions, and all countries are party to the Geneva Conventions, exercise what's called universal jurisdiction over serious war crimes. It doesn't matter, what country you're from or where the violation occurred. Each country has the power and the obligation to prosecute these offenses. So there is litigation risk both from a criminal perspective and a civil perspective, that goes well beyond the question of what any particular U.S. administration either advises you to do or tolerates you doing. The International Criminal, I see one of the questions was about the ICC. Well, the United States is not a party to the ICC, so if you're not well informed, you may be inclined to conclude, I don't have to worry about the ICC because we're not a party to it. That would be a wrong conclusion because the ICC not only has jurisdiction over nationals of countries that are party to the treaty, they have jurisdiction over anyone who commits an offense in the territory of a party to the treaty. I don't think there's any country that has as much global kind of legal exposure than the United States does, given the breadth of our military activities. Now, usually we have status of forces agreements and arrangements in place that protect American service members from the domestic jurisdiction of other countries. Those are not infallible, but those also don't apply to the International Criminal Court. So, in other words, bottom line is that whether it's because of the legal systems of other countries, because of the legal systems of international accountability mechanisms like the International Criminal Court, or because of the possibility that the next US administration may see things differently than this administration does, businesses have to be mindful of all those possibilities in connection with how they interpret legal obligations under the law of armed conflict.
Wow. That was a Luke close moment. It brings it back to the fact there's a global consideration for law and laws of conflict as you do business, and you're a member of the Global Chamber. Uh, I want to give you a round of applause, but also ask, is it possible we might reach out to you in the future to bring you back with such powerful shares that I think meaning for almost every Global Chamber member?
There's no doubt that Jeff and I both have a lot more to say.
I think we're both easily found on our law school websites.
So, Doug, is the Global Chamber CEO, any closing remarks from you before we adjourn?
Thank you, and sorry for asking a more complicated question given a short amount of time. To your point, you both have a lot to say. You're both very intelligent. You're both very experienced. Your perspectives are very valuable, and you've demonstrated that today. Thank you very much for speaking at Global Chamber.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everyone.
Okay.
Have a great Memorial Day weekend.
Bye, Gabor.
Bye, Jeff. Bye, Christopher. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Professor Gabor, Professor Rana. Everyone else, take care.